Well, let's get into your conducting life. As a conductor myself, I imagine coming into the room at Corey, they just started a new project, for instance, for the Europeans. Everybody's obviously very good, very well prepared. And you get into the room, but what do you do then? I can imagine that it would be hard to find stuff to really do, but maybe not. I'd like to know about that process, starting a new project where you have a well prepared, not the best anymore, but the best band in the world, let's say for now.
Yes, a lot of people ask me this, so they imagine that I walk into the room and bring the baton down and immediately everything sounds perfect. I'm very pleased to be here today to dispel that myth. That is not what happens. Yeah. I mean, conducting Corey is in many ways like conducting any other band, although I could probably caveat that and say it's unlike conducting any other band, really. The similarities are that you've basically got a room of 28 people who have all come from, the other part of their life, maybe their job or their family or what have you. And we've got as diverse a range of people as every other band, really. But they walk into the band room door and all of that other life is kind of left outside and everyone comes together with this shared objective of making this great music. And like I say, that's not unique to Corey Band. That I've just described every single band in the world, really. But yeah, so there are a few differences. I mean, I don't need to tell you, but my job as a conductor, basically as a listener in the room.
Please tell for the audience, obviously.
Yeah. So when you're conducting, most people think, you kind of stand at the front and wave your arms around and that's your key job. I mean, that obviously is a part of the job, but I've been doing that. I've been conducting for so long now that part kind of happens without me even thinking about it, the physicality of it. By far, I think the most important job of a conductor is to actually just listen to the sounds which the band are making in the room. And this is where you add value, or this is where you do your main job, if you like, which is basically you listen to that sound, you suggest constructively ways in which that can improve or that can move along whichever road you want it to move along, and then you use your communication skills, which don't have to be speaking. I mean, a lot of stuff with good musicians you can correct as you go along, but I'll say that your communication skills you use to then get your message across, to get people to focus on the things that you think are important. And then obviously you repeat and you go back. And as you go back as the conductor again, you just listen again and you monitor whether the things which you're trying to improve are improving. If they are, great, then you're doing a good job. If they're not, then you have to go back and try another way of, getting things to improve. And again, I'm sure all conductors of bands will consider this, but when I talk about that process of continual improvement, I'm talking on various different levels. So you can hear a sound in front of you, for example, which is like, let's say, for example, not in tune. Then you might stop the band and say, okay, that's not in tune. We need to do something about that. Let's listen a bit more carefully on that chord. And we play the chord again, still not in tune. So you then, as your conductor, you kind of use your ears and you think, oh, well, there's something wrong in, let's say, for example, the horn section. I mean, there's hardly anything ever wrong in the horn section, but let's just say, for example, in which case you start to kind of narrow things down, and your job as the conductor is to get right to where the issue is and solve it. And so that's on the sort of lowest level. But then continually as a conductor, and I suppose this is where strategy comes more into it, and especially with Corey Band, because we have so many projects that we have to keep a lot of plates spinning all at the same time. But you start to think about how to get the band to the best quality on the longer term, and that's when you're kind of more looking at the diary and looking at how to manage pieces of music. And so the typical rehearsal with Corey will involve a lot of different pieces of music, typically, some of which might be in the first rehearsal of a test piece that you're doing in a month's time, in which case the performance quality won't be anywhere near perfect yet. But other pieces might be some that you're doing on a CD recording like next week, in which case you need those to be kind of further advanced, so you've been practicing them for a while. Whereas other pieces might be stuff that you're doing on a concert literally the day after tomorrow, and those pieces you would expect again to be on a different level. So that's the other level of things with Corey Band. You're always kind of balancing different projects and trying to make sure that music kind of evolves and comes to its best quality at the right time. So I think that's probably a difference between Corey and some other bands which might not have such a packed diary. But we definitely pack in the engagements at Corey.
Yeah, if I can just touch upon this, because as a conductor in the Netherlands, we don't have that many concerts going along. So the music you're rehearsing is nearly always for the next event. But would you say that is a good thing, or do you say maybe you'll just have some music that's not for the next event, but which you do practice to get the band to a new level, or to practice on a different aspect of the band, like tuning or technique or whatever?
We don't have time to do that at Corey. I mean, we expect the standards to be really sky high anyway. And no, we don't. Every minute of every rehearsal is taken up with something which is, I mean, if I use the word functional, it sounds boring, but you know what I mean. We're rehearsing a piece of music that we're going to be playing in public at some point soon, and obviously I can use those pieces as my way of kind of developing the band, keeping the standard as high as possible. I mean, that would be my next point about the difference between Corey and other bands is that level of expectation. Obviously, at Corey, I can set, as I'm the musical director of the band, so I can set my own expectations. And again, I think any musical director of any band can set their own expectations. But we have all sorts of things like, we will never do a rehearsal where we don't have every member there. Even if a member can't be there because they're ill or whatever, I'll always get a deputy player in. Yeah. So we always have a full band. That's my expectation, and everyone else's expectation as well. With that expectation, obviously, I find they really are committed to try and make sure that they're all there. We also always start on time. In fact, as long as I can remember, we've always started at least 5 minutes early. So the official start time is 7:30, but people often text me and say, I'm going to be there at 7:26. So sorry, I'm late. It's like, well, you're not officially late, but you probably will miss the start of rehearsal. And those are just some kind of external expectations. But then, of course, as soon as the band starts playing and I go into this conducting activity of listening, anything that isn't 100% perfect, I can pull the band up on. And that's the expectation, is they expect me to do that. And therefore I expect them to get as close to that perfection as possible.
I can imagine, yeah. But let's continue this topic, because what would you say is then the different in approach when you're working with other bands you go to, or maybe even lower section bands, as to Corey? Because obviously you say you can't work on long-term things with Corey, because you always have the expectance that it's going to be very good, and it is very good. But what do you do when you go to for instance, a lower section band or a different band abroad, which is not at that level? What do you do then?
I mean, the main activity is the same. You wave your arms around, you listen, you comment. But I think what I find going to different bands is that you do have to slightly adjust your expectation level. Obviously, you need to make it kind of, you need to set an ambitious expectation for whichever band you're conducting. But sometimes you use your ears and you listen and you think, okay, there's multiple directions I could go here. For example, shall I comment on the fact that it's out of tune there? Shall I comment on the fact that that's not together? Shall I comment on the balance issues? Shall I comment on a particular player that I think isn't doing the right thing? I mean, there's a million ways you can go. And that's I guess that's where it gets difficult, really, is kind of making that prioritization in your mind. But I would also say there's a difference between if I go and just do a one-off rehearsal with another band, there would be a slight difference there than if I was doing a series of rehearsals over a longer period with a band. I mean, bands that I've worked with longer term, I have found, my own experience, it's taken approximately 6 months of me in every rehearsal saying the same thing to the band. It's taken about 6 months before I've noticed any real change. So it takes a long, long time. For example, a big one for me is we have lots of very enthusiastic brass bands here in the UK, and some of them I think play too loud. And I think, for example, if you're listening to a band and you can hear that it's out of tune and people are making mistakes and the sound isn't good, you could comment on any of those three things, or you could just say, can we not quite play so loud, not be quite as enthusiastic? And we find that will solve all of those problems. But people do love giving passion and enthusiasm and what have you. So that kind of message of, look, if you don't play quite as loud, then the quality is going to be much, much better. Like I say, that takes months and months and months of saying the same thing again and again and again. So that, that might give you an example of how I would work with lower section bands.
That's very interesting, because I think most conductors imagine it going faster than 6 months, but 6 months is quite a while to get something a little bit better. But
because you're talking about changing the culture, and the same thing, you could say the same thing about starting on time, because I've had various conversations with various conductors over the years, and I remember one came to me once and said, I just can't get people to turn up on time. We start at 7:30 and people kind of wander in at 7:45. And it's like, well, okay, well, all right, let's push the rehearsal back then. We'll start at 7:45, to help those people. And all of a sudden people are coming in at 8:00. What can I do about that? The conductor felt powerless. And I just said, well, you've just got to stick to your guns. It takes a long time to change the culture of an organization. You can't just say, right, we're going to, you need to be here at 7:30 as of next rehearsal. It's not going to work. People need time to get used to these ideas. And if you as the conductor, you're going to start at 7:30 and you're going to make some policy like, if you're late, then you have to wait at the door until we've finished whatever piece or whatever, and then you have to come in and then you're expected to apologize for being late and tell everyone why you're late. This maybe sounds a bit over the top. I don't know. I'm just talking off the top of my head, but it's a way which
it is a policy, and that's good.
It's a way that you could look to change the culture of the band. Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly, at Corey, and everyone knows if they're going to miss a rehearsal or they're going to be late, they have to tell me. They don't tell someone else, or they don't not tell anyone at all. They have to tell me. And that works. But if it ever didn't work and someone missed a rehearsal and hadn't told anyone or didn't know, no one knew where they were, then obviously I would need to follow that up, because that's the culture of the band that I want to make. So yeah, so you can change culture, but I would contend it takes months or years, not just overnight.
You said you're listening and you try to fix things. Would you say you have a fixed repertoire of how you approach different problems, or are you always looking for a new way to solve the same problem?
Generally, the approach I take to problem solving is to encourage the musicians sitting around me to listen better to each other. In other words, I try to encourage them to take as much responsibility for their own contribution as possible. I would say if you were to sum up my technique of working with any band, that's what I would do. So if we go back to, I keep going back to this example, if something's out of tune, maybe I can hear that it's sharp, so it's a bit above pitch, but rather than saying to the player, that's sharp, pull your slide out or whatever, or use a trigger, I would generally tend to say to the player, can you hear anything wrong with that note? And expect an answer. And they might say no, in which case I'll say, well, listen to it in comparison with this note, for example, and pick out another note in the chord that someone else is doing. And they might eventually say, oh yeah, there's something bit wrong with it. And kind of work with people in that way, really, to empower them to develop their own listening skills. And then I think, I mean, obviously everyone in Corey Band is really, really good at listening to each other, and it just makes rehearsals so much more efficient. So it's just a kind of encouraging people to take responsibility for their own playing, their own contributions, really.
And naturally, that's also the long game, because it's not going to change instantly. You also have to wait a long time for it to evolve.
Yeah, I mean, in lower section bands, that the issue of tuning is just, I mean, it's like a swear word, really. Sometimes I feel going into a lower section band as something's out of tune, which it often is. I don't really want to say the T word because it feels like a naughty word because I always think it's much easier for a lower section band to listen and tell whether they're playing together or not, whether they're playing at the same moment in time as each other. Most people can hear that. But when you're talking about tuning, a lot of people can't hear that. And that's because they're not practiced in hearing that. So I do think it's something that needs to be addressed. And like you say, you can't say to someone, that's out of tune, can you fix it? And if they've no experience of doing that, you can't expect them to be able to do it. I mean, at Corey Band, I can do that. I can say to a player, that note's out of tune. Can you please fix it for next time? And they'll know what to do.
Yeah, the difference between Corey and other bands are obvious, but it's good to hear that the approach is the same.
Yep, it definitely is. But the approach is just basically bringing 28 people together in harmony. That's it.